Helsinki Commission will come to order. I'm joined, of course, by our co-chair, Congressman Hastings. I know that others of the Commission will be joining us. Today, the Helsinki Commission focuses on the threat to free media in the OSCE region. Media freedom is inextricably linked to the right to freedom of expression and the free flow of information, fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act. This year, we celebrate the 35th anniversary of the historic document. This month marks the 20th anniversary of the Copenhagen documents, which includes provisions expressing a wide range of human rights, including freedom of expression. Seemingly on a daily basis, we receive reports documenting harassment of independent media and journalists by the authorities in some participating states. From burdensome registration requirements or visits by the tax police to the confiscation of entire print runs or imposition of crippling fines, from criminal charges for defamation of individuals, institutions, or the state, free media faces merited threats and challenges today. In an alarming number of instances, journalists are targeted for physical attacks and murder. A year ago this month, I chaired a commission hearing and heard from the widow of Forbes magazine writer and investigative journalist Paul Klebnikov, gunned down in a contract-style killing outside the Moscow office nearly 7 years ago. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, of the 52 journalists killed in Russia since 1992, more than a third were principally focused on corruption or human rights. Russia was included in CPJ's 2010 Impunity Index of countries where journalists are slain or killers go free. While Russia is distinct for the scope of the anti-press violence, it's by no means alone in the OSCE region. Over the past years, journalists have been slain in Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Bulgaria. While these investigative journalists paid the ultimate price for their professional endeavors, scores of their colleagues throughout the OSCE region have been targeted for harassment, violent attacks, or imprisonment. The Commission is circulating a resolution on investigative journalists that we plan to raise at the upcoming OSCE Parliamentary Assembly annual meeting in Oslo, devoted this year to the theme, Rule of Law, Combating Transnational Crime and Corruption. The Commission is likewise concerned over moves by some OSCE countries to curtail or control the operations of independent media through the adoption of restrictive laws, including those targeting use of the Internet. For example, in Belarus, a country I visited a year ago, a recently adopted measure on the Internet gives cause for concern given the already tightly controlled media environment there. We are also carefully monitoring recent developments in the Ukraine, where there have been a growing protest by journalists in reaction to stepped-up pressures on the media. Free media plays an essential role in a truly democratic society, and not surprisingly, authoritarians and other anti-democratic forces often target them for particularly harsh reprisals. Our responsibility is to speak out. When journalists come under fire, or when governments attempt to clamp down on the right of freedom of expression. Today's hearing is part of the Helsinki Commission's ongoing effort to draw attention to the plight of investigative journalists and others who place themselves at risk for their work that helps strengthen democracy and human rights. At a Commission briefing late last year, Violence and Impunity, Life in the Russian Newsroom, the editor of one of the country's independent newspapers, a professional who had been buried a handful of colleagues killed because of their reporting, concluded his testimony with an impassioned request that these and similar cases be raised at every opportunity. And that sums up why we're here today, to continue our focus on protecting journalists in the free media. With that, I turn to my co-chair, Congressman Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I note Secretary Posner comes in as we proceed. Mr. Chairman, I have a rather lengthy statement, and I would ask unanimous consent that the full statement be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
And because of the gravity of this issue and the substantial witnesses that we have, last night I read Ms. Mayadovich's prepared testimony that she's offering to us. And I know the work of Mr. Patton and have read of Mr. Suleimanov. I think we would be better advised if I would forego any opening statement and allow for questions, and that way we'll have more opportunity to hear from all of our witnesses. We're expecting to vote on the House floor soon.
We're certainly pleased to have Secretary Posner with us. Any opening comments?
No, just to say I'm delighted to be here, and I very much look forward to hearing from our witnesses and on this important topic. Thank you.
Well, we are pleased to have the recently appointed OSCE representative on freedom of the media on our first panel today during her first visit to the United States since assuming the position. I point out that the OSCE has created this position because of the importance of the free media to our OSCE principles. Ms. Mijatovic brings a wealth of professional experience to her position with the OSCE. She is an expert on media law and regulation. I would also point out that she has provided important leadership on the promotion of investigative journalism, as well as protection of freedom of expression and information in times of crisis. Her complete bio is on the outside table for those who wish to have a copy of it. It's a pleasure to have you with us. You may proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairman Carden, Chairman Hastings. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be invited to this hearing before the Helsinki Commission at the very beginning of my mandate, as you already mentioned. I feel privileged to speak before you today. The Helsinki Commission's welcoming statement on the day of my appointment is a clear manifestation of the strong support you continuously show toward the work of this unique office. And I assure you, distinguished commissioners, that this fact is very much appreciated. It will be 3 months tomorrow since I took office as the new representative on freedom of the media to the OSCE. Even though 3 months may sound short, it has proved more than enough to gain a deep insight and unfortunately voice concerns about the decline of media freedom in many of the 56 countries that today constitute the OSCE. Although the challenges and dangers that journalists face in our countries may differ from region to region, one sad fact holds true everywhere. The freedom to express ourselves is questioned and challenged from many sides. Some of these challenges are blatant, others concealed, some of them follow traditional methods to silence free speech and critical voices, some use new technologies as the way of suppressing and restricting the free flow of information and media pluralism, and far too many result in a physical violence and deadly violence against journalists. And today I would like to draw your attention to the constant struggle of many institutions, including your commission and my own institutions and many NGOs around the world, struggling to combat and ultimately stop the violence against journalists around the world. I would also like to address several other challenges that I want to place in the center of my professional activities, each of which I intend to improve by relentlessly using the public voice I'm giving now at the OSCE. So let me first start with the violence against journalists. Ever since it was created in 1997, my office has been raising attention to the alarming increase of violent attacks against journalists. Not only in the high number of violent attacks against journalists, a cause for concern is and equally alarming is the authorities' far too prevalent willingness to classify many of the murders as unrelated to journalists' professional work. We also see that more and more often critical speech is being punished with questionable and maybe, if I may call it, fabricated charges brought against the journalists. Impunity of perpetrators and the responsible authorities' passivity in investigating and failing to publicly condemn these murders breeds further violence. There are numerous cases that need to be raised over and over again. We need to continue and to loudly repeat the names of these courageous individuals who lost their lives for the words they have written. I'm sorry for all those whom I will not mention today, but the names that follow are on the list that I call Hall of Shame. Hall of Shame. And the Hall of Shame of those governments that still have not brought to justice the perpetrators of horrifying murders that happened in their countries. The most recent murder of a journalist in the OSCE area is the one of Kyrgyz opposition journalist Gennady Pavlyuk. It gives me hope that the new interim government of Kyrgyzstan has announced to save no efforts to bring the perpetrators to justice, not only about the murder of the Gennady Pavlyuk, but also the murder of Alisher Saipov in 2007. The Russian Federation remains the OSCE participating state where most members of the media are killed. Paul Krivnikov, Anna Politkovskaya, Anastasia Baburova, Mohamed Evloev, and many others. We also should not forget the brutal murders on the following journalists, and some remain unresolved even today. Hrant Dink, Armenian, Turkish, Elmar Husseinov, Slavko Čuruvija in Serbia, and Milan Pantic also in Serbia in 2001. Duško Ivanović in Montenegro, and many others. Violence against journalists equals violence against society and democracy, and it should be met with harsh condemnation and prosecution of the perpetrators. There can be no improvement without an overhaul of the very apparatus of prosecution and law enforcement starting from the very top of the government pyramid. There is no true press freedom as long as journalists have to fear for their lives while doing their job. The OSCE commitments oblige all participating states to provide safety to these journalists. And I will do my best to pursue this goal with the mandate I'm given and with all professional tools at my disposal. We also observe another very worrying trend, more and more often the imprisonment of critical journalists based on political motivations, including fabricated charges. And let me mention some cases. In Azerbaijan, Noel Fatulayev was sentenced in 2007. Only a few weeks ago, the European Court of Human Rights found Azerbaijan in violation of Article 10 and Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights. There is only one possible outcome. Fatulayev should be immediately released. In Kazakhstan, Ramazan Yezergepov. Bloggers in Azerbaijan, Emin Milian and Hajade. In Uzbekistan, in many other countries. I will continue to raise my voice and demand the immediate release of media workers in prison for their critical work. I join Chairman Cardin for commending independent journalists in the Helsinki Commission's recent statement on the World Press Freedom Day. These professionals pursue truth, wherever it may lead them, often to a great personal risk. They indeed play a crucial and indispensable role in advancing democracy and human rights. By highlighting these murders and imprisonment cases, by no means do I intend to neglect other forms of harassment and intimidation that also have a threatening effect on journalists. Let me just recall that with the heightened security concerns in the last decade, police and prosecutors have increasingly raided editorial offices, journalists' homes, or seized their equipment to find leaks that were perceived as security threats. Turning to the problem of the internet freedom, we can see that new media have changed the communications and education landscape in even more dramatic manner than did the broadcast media in the last half century. Under my mandate, the challenges has remained the same. How to safeguard or enhance pluralism and free flow of information, both classical Helsinki obligations within the OSCE. The digital age offers promise of a truly democratic culture of participation and interactivity. Realizing that promise, it is a challenge of our times. In the age of borderless internet, the protection of the right to freedom of expression, regardless of frontiers, takes on a new and more powerful meaning. In the age of rapid technological change and convergence, archaic governmental controls over the media are increasingly unjust, indefensible, and ultimately unsustainable. Despite progress, many challenges remain, including the lack of poor quality of national legislation relating to freedom of information, a low level of implementation in many OSCE member states, and existing political resistance. The internet fundamentally affects how we live. It offers extraordinary opportunities for us to learn, trade, connect, create, and also to safeguard human rights and strengthen democratic values. These rights, possibilities, and ideals are at the heart of the Helsinki process and the OSCE principles and commitments that we share. We must find the best way to spread access to the internet so that the whole world can benefit from what it can offer, rather than increasing the existing gap between those who have access to information and those who do not. Restrict access to information and your chances to develop will become restricted. Open up the channels of free communication and your society will find ways to prosper. I was delighted to hear Secretary of State Clinton speak about basic freedom in her January speech on internet freedom in the museum. This freedom is the freedom to connect. And Secretary Clinton rightly calls this freedom the freedom of assembly in cyberspace. It allows us to come together online, and shape our society in fundamental ways. Fame or money is no longer a requisite to immensely affect our world. My office is rapidly developing a comprehensive strategy to identify the main problems related to internet regulation in 56 member states of the OSCE and ways to address these issues. I will count on the support of the Helsinki Commission to advance the universal value that this strategy will attempt to extend to those countries where these values are still being questioned. Whether we talk about internet regulation, inventive ways to switch to digital while preserving the dominance of a few selected broadcasters, attempts to limit access to information or broadcast pluralism, we must keep one thing in mind. No matter what governments do, in the long run, their attempts to regulate internet is a lost battle. People always find ways to obtain the rights that are denied to them. History has shown this over and over again. In the short run, however, it is very clear that I will intervene with governments which try to restrict the free flow of information. Similar to fighting violence against journalists, my office has been campaigning since its establishment in 1997 to decriminalize defamation and libel in the entire OSCE region. This problem needs urgent reform not only in the new, but also in the old democracies of the OSCE. Although the criminal provisions have not been used in Western Europe for decades, their chilling effect remained. Furthermore, the mere existence of these provisions have served as justification for other states that are unwilling to stop the criminalization of journalistic errors, and instead leave these offenses solely to the civil law domain. Currently, defamation is a criminal offense in all but 10 OSCE countries. My own country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cyprus, Estonia, Georgia, Ireland, Moldova, Romania, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Last three OSCE countries decriminalized defamation, and I mean with Romania, Ukraine, and United Kingdom, and I consider this to be a great success. For a decade, nothing was happening in Western Europe, and this is something that we welcome very much. Some other countries, such as Armenia, are currently reforming their defamation provisions, and I hope that I can soon welcome the next country that carries out this important and very long overdue reform. Dear Chairman, the above problematic areas, violence against journalists, restrictions of new media, including the internet, lack of pluralism, and resistance to decriminalize defamation are among the most urgent media freedom problems that need our attention and concentrated efforts today. However, we will also not forget about many other fields where there is plenty of room to improve. Of course, I will not miss the excellent opportunity that we are here together today to raise your attention to the topic that my distinguished predecessor, Miklos Harashti, has already raised with you, the establishment and the adoption of a federal shield law in the United States. As you know, my office has been a dedicated promoter of the federal shield law for many years. If passed, the Free Flow of Information Act would provide a stronger protection to journalists. It could ensure the imprisonment such as that of Judith Miller and Josh Wolf could never again take place and hinder investigative journalism. But the passage of such legislation would resonate far further than within the borders of the United States of America. It could send a very much needed signal and set a precedent to all countries where protection of sources is still opposed by governments and is still not more than a dream for journalists. I respectfully ask all of you to continue and even increase your efforts to enable that the Free Flow of Information Act soon becomes the latest protector of media freedom in the United States. And of course, I cannot close my speech without mentioning my home country, Bosnia and Herzegovina. As you know, not only Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also most of the emerging democracies in the Balkans enjoy modern and forward-looking media legislation. We can only say that we almost have it all when it comes to advanced legal and regulatory framework, enabling free expression to thrive. But it is not that simple. I use this moment to pose several questions. If there are good laws, then why do we still face severe problems in relation to media freedom? Why do we stagnate and sometimes even move backwards? Where does the problem lie? And more importantly, how we can solve it and move ahead. What Bosnia and Herzegovina shows us is that the good laws in themselves are not enough. Without their good implementation, there are only documents filled with unrealized potential. In countries that struggle with similar problems, we must stress over and over again, without the full implementation of valid legislation, without genuine political will, without a comprehensive understanding of media's role in functioning democracy, without the creation of safe environment for journalists to their work, and without true commitments by all actors, these countries risk falling far behind international standards. Apart from unmet expectations, we all know that the consequences of politicized and misused media could be very serious. In conclusion, let me assure you that I will not hesitate to openly and vigorously remind any country of their responsibility toward implementing OSCE commitments to freedom of the media. I'm also asking you today to use this opportunity and send a clear message to the governments of all OSCE countries to do their utmost to fully implement their media legislation safeguarding freedom of expression. The governments have the power to create an environment in which media can perform their unique role free of pressures and threats. Without this, no democracy can flourish. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your very comprehensive presentation. We very much appreciate that. We hope you will use every opportunity to present your issues, and we would have been disappointed if you appeared before us without making an ask in regards to our shield law. That was a very well-placed point that the United States, which takes a great pride in the freedom of our press and the ability of investigative reporters to operate without intimidation from government officials, there's still progress that we can make. And I think you are absolutely correct, and I know that's an issue that is being carefully looked at, and we hope that we'll be able to make some progress on the shield law here at the federal level. Of course, we do have local shield laws, but we do need a federal shield law in order to provide the comprehensive protection. In your statement, you mentioned the number of investigative journalists who have been murdered in regards to their work, and you mentioned Georgi Gangazda. His widow is with us today, and I just really want to acknowledge Miroslava for being with us today. And it's been 15 years, and the perpetrators have still not been brought to justice. And I know there's an individual story for each one of these investigative journalists who have been murdered, and it's important that the world understand that. I think one of our challenges is to continue to put a spotlight on this, and you're certainly doing that by your early work in your position, and we encourage you to do that. We need to get to support the NGO communities that are working on this. We need to raise these issues at our international meetings. We need to have a higher priority in the bilateral talks among our member states to include journalists as far as issues of concern. Unfortunately, there are just too many countries that are part of the where unsolved murders have taken place or where laws need to be changed, and we have a lot of work yet to be done. To me, when investigative journalists are intimidated, it puts a very chilling effect on going after and holding governments accountable, particularly as it relates to public corruption and as to public accountability. So to me, that is at the top of the list as far as areas that question the sincerity of a government in carrying out its Helsinki commissions. We need to continue to cite specific examples. Unfortunately, without doing that, countries slide into these regressions, and it's causing incredible challenges within the OSCE. So I want you to know you have in this commission an institution that wants to work in partnership with you to place the spotlight on those countries that need to make change. To me, our highest priority is to protect the individual journalist that's out there, and to make sure that countries provide the working conditions where free media can exercise its opportunities. And unfortunately, there's just too many places where that's not the case. We certainly have a lot of work to do in regards to criminal defamation. I didn't realize there was only 10 states that have decriminalized it. That's inexcusable. We really need to make that a much higher priority. And then lastly, on the internet, technology is a real blessing, but some countries are using technology to block the access of free internet in their country. and they're being complicitous by some of the private companies out there that are yielding to that type of pressure. So I guess my point is more of an observation rather than a question. We need to have a common agenda. There's a lot to be done, and we need to develop a strategy that we can work together, because everything you said are areas that the Helsinki Commission strongly supports and wants to clearly work with you as a partner in this area. And with that, let me turn to Congressman Hastings.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator. And Ms. Mijatovic, thank you for your piercing testimony. Senator, with your permission and hers, I'm sure that we would receive her full statement and put it on the Commission website. But I also intend, after reading it last night, to make sure that it is a part of the House record, so that the information can be more widely disseminated. I thought you did a concise job in covering the waterfront. Picking up where the Senator left off on the question of a common agenda, Ms. Mijatovic, other parliamentary bodies, the UN, the International Parliamentary Union, other structures that are multilateral, going forward with any kind of a common agenda, particularly zeroing in on digitalization and the Internet's widespread usage around the world. What's happening out there other than within your mandate that you know about or that we might plug into? And is there any particular usefulness in trying to have a conference that will allow for countries to learn best practices and to discuss among themselves how best to come to some common understanding about this technology?
Thank you. It's a very valid question. If I just may mention, the recent conference we had in Central Asia, where we invited 5 Central Asian states. The conference took place in Tajikistan, in Dushanbe, and we were discussing access to information and new digital media. Those conferences are crucial, especially in the countries, so in the emerging democracies, where we have problems with education, where we have problems even with telecommunication infrastructure, not to mention the internet access. When it comes to other bodies dealing with these particular issues, I know that most of international organizations are dealing with this issue from a different angles. Council of Europe from a human rights angle, European Commission more from a commercial and technological. But the main problem I see in, if I may call them emerging democracies, in the countries where we need to put much more efforts, so not just the OSCE, and try to find maybe a common goal and common agenda where there is much needed coordination, something that could bring these areas into a new era with education, with sharing best practices. Because what is seen and what I managed to see in the last 3 months, traveling in several countries, that new media and digitalization as such is used as a new tool, a very powerful, very dangerous tool to further restrict and suppress, with explanations that are not true to the citizens, with the explanations that there is a need for certain moratoriums of the frequency in the period before the media can switch to digital terrestrial, with the ways of restricting the frequencies. And new media is all about opening up and giving more possibilities for a free flow of information. So if I understood correctly, it was also your suggestion to try to find a way to cooperate the different institutions and different bodies are tackling this problem with a common goal. We already have a very good cooperation with the Council of Europe, and we work a lot on different issues, not just the digitalization, but many others. But maybe some broader agenda is also needed.
It certainly seems an appropriate area for us to probe. Regarding your own mandate and your own good offices, and I'm nobody's auditor, nor am I interested in precision with reference to your resources. But while I'm an advocate of more is better in some instances, it would be my belief, having seen this office develop over the years, since 1997, that you do have too little in the way of real resources to be able to do what amounts to too much in the final analysis. Is that a fair statement? What do your resources look like to cover your mandate?
So if I may, they call it the cheapest, the smallest, and the most efficient. We are a very small institution. There are 15 of us, but the team is great. And I must say, I'm just 3 months in the office. The work and the quality of work that is done in that office, and the way the flow of information and receiving the information from the fields, also from the missions, is going on in something that I welcomed very much the moment I entered the office. But you are right. I mean, we have limited resources, and in the Corfu process there are several discussions in relation to strengthening the institution by increasing the budget, human resources, I mean all the issues that are related to it. But
well, you certainly have my support, and I believe I can say our support in that effort. Experience teaches that when I'm traveling, even outside the sphere of OSCE, and I bring up the core principles of democracy and include in it freedom of the press with interlocutors, it's sort of like a yeah, there you go again, kind of expression from them, whether they be premiers, presidents, foreign ministers, or whomever. And I do not just reference Europe. I can go other places around the world and you meet that same thing. Recently, I raised with Kazakhstan through its embassy questions regarding their tightening and restrictions, and now they're the chair in office, and we have these core principles that we are supposed to be adherents to as members of OSCE, and now they're the leaders, and I fought for them to be the leader, and I think rightly so. The response that I got, I don't know whether it's true, and I don't seek to know much more other than to point out how countries will utilize things to show their point of view. It was that Russia, from Russia, untoward things were coming in to Kazakhstan that they wanted to stop. And I can see that happening. I'm not a follower of the blogs, but I'm fond of saying what I know to be true, and that is that if my dead mother was alive, she wouldn't recognize me about some of the things that they say on the blogs and the liberties that are taken, not to mention defamation or libel or those kind of things. As a politician, I'm supposed to be able to take that kind of heat. But as a country, when stuff is directed towards you to weaken you or to cause you problems, then what should be a country's reaction? Not just Kazakhstan, what should Bosnia-Herzegovina or the United States or anyone, if an attack to weaken them is utilized in that way? It's a very sticky point. I hope I'm making myself clear.
If I understood correctly, so you are actually questioning in the possible interference with our work or possible undermining the autonomy that we have, so the independence of the office. What would happen? I mean, it would be very difficult for me to say that, at the very beginning of my mandate. But what I experience by now, for example, if I may use the Kazakh chairmanship and the way they were treating this office in these 3 months, I can only praise them for the way they were dealing with the cooperation, the coordination we had, and the support. There was no one single moment where I could say that there was interference with the work of this very unique and important office. On the other side, I'm very sad to say and to share that the Kazakhs didn't deliver on the issue when it comes to the commitments in relation to media freedom. And that is something that I will raise at my next visit to Kazakhstan, to Astana, for the Tolerance Conference that will take place end of June, but also at informal ministerial meeting. So those two issues, when it comes to the operations and the work of the office, as I said, I can only praise them and say that there were great support from the very moment I was appointed. But when it comes to the issues related to commitments, media freedom commitments, that is something that we need to do much more.
Right. Finally, Senator, if I may. Fremont Duve from Germany was actively involved, and the senator and I both witnessed his work in the early stages. And somehow or another, through his office, and I don't know whether it was his personal ability to do it or not, but we had awards that we were giving annually to courageous journalists and their families. And I just would like to see something like that restored. It's been a number of years now. I remember handing out those awards here when the Parliamentary Assembly came to Washington for the first time. And it was a very moving experience. It came late in the session and everybody stayed because of its importance. Now, I know it takes money to give all those kinds of awards, but please investigate that, and if there is anything that we can do to try to find those that are interested in offering such support, then I would like to be involved in that, because I think it helps to do what the senator pointed out, and that is, for lack of a better expression, to put a lamp on these things. And the more we raise them, whether somebody is in prison in Azerbaijan or in Uzbekistan, I've learned that it does get back to them. And in this kind of setting, journalists then, it spreads widely, and the information is disseminated, and it causes some change within the framework of those countries. I apologize for the length of my questions, and thank you, Senator, for the time.
Let me just underscore what Congressman Hastings said. We obviously want to put spotlights on countries that need to make change and do it in the most effective way, but it's also good to highlight those who have been courageous, to support their efforts, and I think that's what Congressman Hastings has suggested that we've done in the past, and I agree with Tim. There are ways that we can do that without significant increase in resources. I just think bringing attention to people who have been in the struggle, who have accomplished things, are important for us to do. As I pointed out, the response.
Well, I can only say that I'm aware of the initiative Freimuth Duve started. I met Mr. Duve back in '97, just after the war started in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he was extremely active in bringing all these problems and these extremely important issues in public, not only by giving the awards, but also organizing something that I thought played a role in my own country. They were called mobile culture containers. So, traveling around the country that experienced horrible war, trying to bring people together, journalists together. So he was very much involved at the very beginning of the mandate of the office in these exercises. As far as I know, these ideas they are still there, but the problem is, as you said, the financial means that are not important and not something that I should raise here today. But there are also other ways. I mean, in order to raise these issues, you need a voice, and that is something that I will use vigorously, and I will not have any hesitation to do that. But any idea like that is something that we will definitely explore.
One of the strengths of the Helsinki Commission is that it's a hybrid in that it includes both the members of Congress and the executive branch, and we're very pleased that Secretary Posner has been an extremely active member of our commission.
Thank you. I want to, if I may, just follow up on a question that Congressman Hastings asked. And first of all, I want to thank you for your testimony. Very clear, very lucid, very informative. And I enjoyed our conversation yesterday as well. One of the things we talked about yesterday is the balance between trying to get governments to work together and cooperate, and at the same time for that cooperation not to impose in the internet context a new set of constraints or restrictions on what's been a quite free-flowing source of information. And I wonder if you would say something about that, give us a little flavor of some of the discussions that are going on in Europe and within the OSCE region, and give us some guidance on principles that ought to be informing the way we look at these issues.
Thank you. As I said at the very beginning, the worrying trend of using new media and digitalization as a new tool, powerful tool to restrict free flow of information, is something that my office will continue to work on. As I said in my speech, we are developing a strategy where we will try to find the best practices, but also the worst practices in the OSCE member states. And that publication will also be available to you, because I think that is the first step we need to do in order to have a clear picture in which direction to move. In order to give you, as you said, a bit of flavor, I can mention the case we are now on, and that's Armenia, and their law, broadcasting law, which is also called the law on digitalization. I had visited Armenia a month ago, and I had an honor to meet their president and also other executive bodies of the parliament, government, and I can see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel there. We are hoping to have a clear results any day from now, and the cooperation the government showed during the visit, but also afterwards, by pulling the law out from the procedure in order to allow public consultations. So the citizens, NGOs, and also my office offers the assessment of the law with the clear recommendations, was something that was very much welcome. At the moment, we still do not know what will happen. I do hope for the best possible result, because that would be an example in Caucasus, but also for all other countries that are struggling to switch to digital terrestrial broadcasting, which will offer benefits to the citizens and not restrict information. And the law had several issues that we raised in our recommendations that were definitely not in line with international standards, and those provisions were suppressing the free flow of information. Those laws were restricting licenses to existing, but also to the new broadcasters. So all of this was raised in a very cooperative and friendly manner, and we do hope that at the end the recommendations will be taken into account, and we have at least the first law that can be called the best practice in the Caucasus region.
Can I follow up just with one further question on that? You said we have to both look at best practices and then practices that are not the best. I know that in Belarus, for example, there's a new set of media restrictions, which are internet restrictions that are about to go into effect. What can you do? What can we do? How do we track these things at an early stage? What are the kinds of responses that are appropriate where we see regulations that are about to make it more difficult for the free flow of information?
Well, Belarus is definitely the case that we can call them, not a good practice. The moment I learned from my predecessor and also from my colleagues that the moment this law was discussed, and that was several years ago, probably 2 years ago, the office was involved from the very beginning. It included visits to the Belarusian government, it included assessments with the recommendations, clear recommendations to the government, setting the standards in order not to restrict free flow of information, not to block the websites, filter the websites, and all these issues that are now present in this law. There were several explanations saying the law is more, just it has a regulatory but not restrictive tools, which I disagree with. And it was also raised during my mandate. Last month I raised this issue in a letter to the foreign minister and also in a public statement. What else can be done? Can we do at this moment? I can only say to continue to fight for a good cause and to try to find a way that the government understands that this law needs to be changed rapidly with the amendments, or just accepting the recommendations that were in the assessment. What I learned that the law enters into force on 1st of July, and we will of course monitor and see what will happen, but that is something that we will continue to raise no matter, that the law is now adopted.
Last, just quick comment from me. As we discussed yesterday, I'm going out next week to Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, 2 other countries where there are a range of these issues. And I very much look forward to working with you after that visit to try to come up with some common strategies. Thank you.
We've been joined by Congressman Smith, the longest-serving member of the Helsinki Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you Chairman, Co-Chairman Hastings, for convening this very important hearing, and to my good friend Mike Posner. And I'm glad he's joined us here. So many of the assistant secretaries who are part of the commission often fail to show. So thank you for being here. Ms. How do you say it? Dunja Mijatovic. Ms. Mijatovic, thank you for the work that you're doing on freedom of the press, and obviously, in my opinion, perhaps the most manipulated part of the press in modern times is the internet. I held a series of hearings, one of which, before I held it some 4.5, 5 years ago, read a book called IBM and the Holocaust. It was a book that detailed in very disturbing chronological way exactly how the Gestapo was able to use the high-tech capabilities of IBM Germany with an assist from some other IBM affiliates to find the Jews. They were the census people of the time, so they used high-tech as a means of significant repression, obviously, that led to the Holocaust and massive slaughter of Jews. Today, we find that the internet has been co-opted as a means of repression as well, as you know so well. And I'm wondering, the Reporters Without Borders has designated Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan as enemies of the internet, and 3 other participating states, Belarus, Russia, and Turkey, are considered countries under surveillance. And obviously there's problems elsewhere, but those 5 jump off the page. And I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, that the very brief but very important report on Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan by Reporters Without Borders be made a part of this record. I appreciate that very much. And I'm wondering if you've looked at any of the legislation that perhaps some of the European countries, the European Parliament, or here in the United States that we've done to try to combat this growing menace, this misuse of what should be an opening up vehicle, which is being used to close down the forces of liberty and human rights. I've introduced legislation called the Global Online Freedom Act, and that bill has a number of mutually reinforcing provisions. We did it with the great input from Reporters Without Borders, Freedom House, who will testify momentarily. They've endorsed the bill. A consortium of human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, have all not only helped draft and work the details, we even have Google now supporting the legislation and endorsing it and asking that it be enacted. Obviously, much of the impetus came out of the misuse of the internet by the PRC, but obviously that, you know, repressive societies share best practices too, and these secret police have been sharing that egregious best practice with these other countries. What the legislation does, and I would ask you for your thoughts on, it seems to me that without, companies have a hard time pushing back when they want to do business. I wish they would, but it is a hard time. It's, you know, a David and Goliath very often type of fight. It needs to be a government-to-government fight in many of our opinions, mine certainly. What the legislation would do, it would create an office within the U.S. Department of State, and we hope that other countries will do this, especially if they are home to large IT giants like we are in the United States. It would set up this office that would be a kind of like a command and control to work the issue of internet freedom. The legislation pushes not unfettered, we don't want hate speech. It is nonviolent political speech and nonviolent religious speech that would be protected. And our hope is that if a country is designated what we call internet restricting country, that country then would have to put personally, that company that does business there, personally identifiable information outside the reach of the repressive country. So that, and we're seeing now, even Yahoo recently did this in Vietnam. They located their, their email servers and the information stored therein outside the country, because we know that Hanoi has been using that to bust up its human rights promoters there as well. It also would require disclosure, what is being censored by governments, and so that we know exactly what, not just China, but these other countries, Belarus, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, are doing to inhibit the free flow of information by way of censorship, and disclosure is kind of like a disinfectant. It seems to me it's a common sense approach. It's ready, frankly, for floor action. We have had buy-in from a whole lot of people, like I said, the NGO community, and increasingly the IT companies, Google being chief among them. In your work, would you find something like this useful? Have you looked at any kind of legislative initiative like this? And if not, I would welcome you to please take a good hard look at it, and we would appreciate your comments.
Thank you very much. When it comes to legislation of any member states of the OSCE, we of course follow any new legislation, all the legislation that is not in compliance with the OSCE commitments. So we will definitely look at this act, and what I welcome from your statement is that the act was drafted with a close cooperation with NGOs, with all the associations that have say in such an important laws. You mentioned also issues that are related to violence and issues of incitement to violence via internet and all the problems that we see there. That is something that is present, and that is something that is a fact. My office has a different role. My office has a role to promote free flow of information. But of course, with awareness that the problems on the internet are something that also need to be tackled in a best possible way, but not by restricting. The best way is, and you mentioned it several times, is cooperation between the countries, sharing the information and trying to find the best possible ways to tackle this very important and dangerous things that we also see on the internet. You didn't mention, but there is also something that goes without saying, that it needs to be tackled with the proper legislation and cooperation between governments. It's child pornography. So there are issues that need regulatory and legal framework, but regulatory and legal framework based on best practices that is not suppressing the free flow of information. And the office will, of course, welcome any legislation that is protecting free speech, but also protecting citizens from any kind of violence or any kind of negative impact that the internet can have when it comes to the free flow of information that is regardless of frontiers. And what we also see, and I mentioned that in my speech, any kind of suppressive ways, any kind of attempts from the governments to regulate, to block, to explain it with a completely different reasons than the actual ones are at the end a lost battle. Because you move your server, you move to a different area and you can access those information. But the important thing is that all these issues are done within the cooperation. And that is something that I think is also missing within the OSCE region, because it can be of enormous help if everybody is aware. And I think with this booklet as a start, I think we'll be able to show the best and the worst practices when it comes to internet legislation.
Ms. Mijanovic, I'm glad you brought up the child pornography issue and all obscenity issues, because we do make provision in the legislation and our law couldn't be more clear in the United States that obscenity is not protected speech. It is a matter of prosecutorial discretion as to whether or not this government, the U.S. government, is serious about that. We do have a number of, and it'd be worth your while at some point on some visit to visit an FBI center housed out nearby in Chantilly, Virginia, where they very aggressively are trying to track down, find, and then prosecute. We have programs like Innocence Lost and other initiatives that are all designed to protect children. And so the more we share those best practices among participating states, I think the better. Unfortunately and sadly, much of the child pornography is produced in the United States. So it does come down to ensuring that we enforce our laws, which make it a serious crime with serious jail time and confiscation of assets, properties, villas, boats, and all the rest for those who are apprehended and then prosecuted and convicted. So I'd like to work with you on that as well. Thank you. Chairman, I just want to make a point. I was late. I had my primary last night, so I was up all night. So it went very well.
You want to give us a report?
70-30. I had a Tea Party candidate, and it went very well. So,
well, we're very good.
Thank you.
Let me just follow up on one point that Congressman Hastings raised. And it's fair to say that on the SHIELD law, the OSCE states will look to the United States for some leadership. So it's important for us to act. But when you're chair in office, we look at the country of the chair in office to not only carry out commitments that were made before the chairmanship began, but also to set an example for other countries. You have specifically mentioned concerns about Kazakhstan in at least two examples. You gave some others. What do you plan to do this year to help Kazakhstan lead by example as it relates to a journalist?
Well, from the very beginning of my mandate, I'm trying to do that, to assist, to help, but also to raise my voice when there is no other means, to point to the problems that the chairmanship is facing when it comes to freedom of the media. The first opportunity I had was a media forum in Almaty at the very beginning of my mandate, when I clearly noted all the problems, and I had a meeting with NGOs and journalists in relation to blocking of certain websites, blocking the forums of Respublika, blocking all different means of information. Pardon me. You know, that is not something that I will start doing. I'm already doing it. I'm raising this with the chairmanship all the time, and as I previously said, my first visit to Astana will take place very soon, where I plan to meet Minister Saudabayev and other officials, and to discuss all the issues in relation to the problem. So I do not see that I should focus only on the chairmanship or United States or my own home country. I go where there are problems, and I also raise the issues, no matter if that country is advanced or not advanced when it comes to media legislation. When it comes to the plans and promises that Kazakhstan did, I mean, those promises were given to 56 member states. The institutions, they didn't have any say in that. And at the moment, what I can see that only one promise that is on the list of promises is in a way tackled, I would say, the cosmetic changes to the law for registration for licensing broadcasters. So I can only say that I will continue to raise the issue in relation to the journalist. I already raised the issue of imprisonment of Yezergekov, which I also mentioned in my speech. And I can only say that I will not have any hesitations because Kazakhstan is the chair in office, but I will even have more focus on that.
Yeah, well, my point is this, and not only the chair in office, but you're seeking to have a summit at the end of the year. It would be useful to have certain progress made in this area that could be very much showcased as the type of practices that are helpful for countries that have been in transition. And it just might be a friendly reminder when you're in Kazakhstan to be able to show demonstrated progress will help all the countries and make the summit much more feasible and productive. Just a thought.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your commitment to this issue, and very, very impressed by the comprehensiveness of your approach, and we agree with you as to the priorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We will now turn to the second panel, which will consist of Sam Patton, who is the Senior Program Manager for Eurasia at Freedom House. Since 1980, Freedom House has issued an annual index on freedom of the press. Its latest edition, Freedom of the Press 2010, the Global Survey of Media Independence, was released in late April. Mr. Patton has had an extensive career in foreign policy, having held a variety of positions in government and the private sector. And Musafar Suleimanov is the Europe and Central Asia Research Associate Committee to Protect Journalists. He joined CPJ in 2007. Prior to joining CPJ, he worked for nonprofits focused on Central Asia. Their complete biographies are also available. We'll start with Mr. Patton.
Thank you, Chairman Cardin. Thank you, Co-Chairman Hastings, Congressman Smith.
By the way, you're more than welcome to remain or leave as you see fit.
I do not mind, I stayed with my colleagues. So.
Not at all.
Thank you, Chairman Cardin, Co-Chairman Hastings, Congressman Smith, and Mrs. Secretary Posner for the opportunity to address this commission on the very important issue of threats to media freedom. It is particularly gratifying to hear Ms. Mijatovic talk about some of her priorities and outline the challenges that lie ahead in her very difficult job as the representative. I'm sure that Mr. Suleimanov will give a more textured understanding of what's going on the day-to-day fight with individual journalists fighting against repressive regimes in the OSCE area. What I would like to do, if I could, in the interest of brevity, is just to summarize my written remarks and give an overall sense from Freedom House and from the analysis that we conduct on a year-to-year basis of where the trends are headed with respect to freedom of the media. Freedom House does, as the chairman noted, produce a number of annual publications, our Freedom in the World publication, also Freedom of the Press publication, and recently we released our Worst of the Worst report of the 10 worst countries in the world. 3 of those countries are within the OSCE region: Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Belarus. So, for that reason, it's particularly relevant to talk about what we see as a very negative trend with respect to media freedoms, not only in the former Soviet countries, but also throughout the region as a whole. We see media freedom and the lack of media freedom attempts to repress and restrict the right to expression as operating in many ways like a terminal disease. And a terminal disease like cancer either operates, either regresses, at which point it's possible for the body to heal, or it metastasizes and becomes much worse. We see what's currently happening in the OSCE environment, particularly in the former communist countries, the Soviet Union, in a very negative trend. I'd like to look at four particular instances that we've noted over the last 10 years. In 2007, we issued a report, Muzzling the Media, and that report looked at a steady regression from 1999 until 2007. It's useful to sort of take that as a point of departure, that there's been a broad, systematic rollback in media freedoms throughout the CIS region, and look at what's happened since then. That rollback began with broadcast media, and most dramatically in Russia. But before the current Russian government moved against Media Most, the Kazakhs already were consolidating their control over broadcast outlets in Kazakhstan in the late 1990s. As Ms. Miyatovich noted, there have been some cosmetic changes as a result of the Madrid pledges, but they're really cosmetic only, and there are serious concerns that persist in Kazakhstan. Azerbaijan has also produced a number of deplorable examples with respect to media freedom, and some of which have been mentioned, and I'm sure there'll be more discussion about those. Most chilling among them, from my own personal perspective, is the so-called donkey case of the two bloggers who produced a fairly harmless video in which a government spokesman was depicted as a donkey and put it up on YouTube. Shortly thereafter, they were attacked in a public cafe in Baku, and after their attack, they were arrested and imprisoned on charges of hooliganism. They now sit in one of the worst jails in Azerbaijan. The chilling effect, even if Azerbaijan has not moved forward as quickly as they probably will with respect to physically restricting the internet, that sends a very chilling message to all other bloggers who might speak out and exercise their rights to freedom of expression under various OSCE documents. The legal framework is an issue of serious concern as well. In each of these three countries, and also throughout the CIS region, we've seen numerous laws that roll back media freedom. Of particular importance, given Kazakhstan's current chairmanship in office, is their internet law. It's nearly 1 year old now. It treats the internet as any other form of media. It hasn't been used in practice yet. There have been no cases yet, but the fact that it exists on the books is a source of serious concern for us. How these countries treat international broadcasters is also a matter of concern. Two of the three countries that I'm just speaking about now, both Russia and Azerbaijan, have taken explicit actions against US-funded broadcasters and other international broadcasters. In my written testimony, I gave Kazakhstan credit for not having done so, but I've subsequently learned that in the last several years, the BBC has been pushed on to less listened to FM frequencies, and there have been some other cases of interference with international broadcasters in Kazakhstan. Not as explicit as the denial of RFERL and VOA to broadcast in Russia and Azerbaijan, but still worrying. And finally, we've seen more recently a clampdown on print media, which is puzzling in a way when you consider that in Russia, Novaya Gazeta has a very, very small circulation and is really read only by a very, very small percentage of the population. However, the ability of the print media to be reproduced on the internet makes it a cause of concern for increasingly authoritarian regimes. Across all three of these countries, we see efforts to restrict the freedom of the media as the first shot across the bow, as it were, when it comes to other moves towards authoritarianism. Most dramatically, we've seen Kyrgyzstan melt down in the last 3 months. Very repressive measures were taken against the media. As Ms. Miyatovich noted, there was 1 and possibly 2 murders that occurred in Kazakhstan in late 2009 and early 2010 related to media issues in Kyrgyzstan. And just prior to the revolution of April, there was an attempt to shut down all foreign broadcasting. So first we see the media come under attack, then other democratic freedoms are repressed after that. There's a contagious effect if we view this as a disease and as a malign disease, not only on the countries of the region of the former CIS and the former communist region, but also the other 56 member states of the OSCE. And some of these issues we've seen, if not as directly related or emanating from the CIS, in countries like Italy or Turkey. In Italy, there have been cases where Google has come under attack from prosecutors for materials that have been posted on YouTube, which is now a subsidiary of Google, and they've been shut down in Italy. In Turkey, because of the Turkishness provisions of the Turkish constitution, there have also, I believe Google has been shut down now twice in Turkey. When the standards are lowered, it sends a very negative message far beyond the CIS region, and that's really what's been happening over the last 3 years. The standards are lowered and various forms of arguments and justifications come forward. With respect to the internet, there are compelling ones. As Congressman Hastings noted, the Kazakhs are legitimately concerned about their own national security, as all states are concerned about their national security. Questions of national characteristics, questions of protecting children. These are all, very, very important issues that need to be addressed. Yet too often, they're either poorly understood or they're taken advantage of as a pretext for larger repressions, particularly on the internet. Several weeks ago, the State Department hosted a roundtable for the Kazakh government and Deputy Foreign Minister to come in and talk about issues with NGOs, which we appreciated. And when the issue of internet freedom was raised, he had sort of a curious response. He said the reason that we have to pass laws like the one that Kazakhstan did pass a year ago is because many of these websites lie. And as Congressman Hastings noted, his mother would know the difference between truth and lies, and most readers know the difference between truth and lies. And it's it's been our experience that governments regulate very poorly when it comes to separating between truth and lies. So that's just an important issue with respect to the power of example that ought to be addressed. Thank you, Chairman Cardin, for raising Kazakhstan and the power of example. There are 6 months remaining in the OSCE chairmanship, and there are some positive things that Kazakhstan can do going forward. In preparing to come here today, I talked to a former Kazakh newspaper publisher who's no longer publishing his newspaper because of media repressions in the country, and I asked him what he thought about the Zhovtis case, the Evgeny Zhovtis case. And while this isn't particularly related to media freedoms, Mr. Zhovtis is in prison in Kazakhstan on separate grounds, it does have a power of example. He said, well, everybody has their Zhovtis. Nazarbayev has his Zhovtis, the Akim of Uralsk has their particular prisoner, and so forth and so on. When the citizens in the country, when the authorities in the country see their president behaving in such a way, it has a contagious effect on how they behave, and certainly all of these countries, given their historical experience, watch each other very, very carefully. In terms of what to do going forward, the specific cases that have been talked about today, it's very important to raise these cases. It's equally important to look at the trends that they represent and where they're going, because we see a negative trend. Yet raising the cases, doing so in a public manner, wherever possible. We know that the Department of State does raise these behind closed doors in their meetings with foreign ministries. To do so publicly and in the press does put the pressure on governments that's necessary to have positive change. The power of example has been discussed. Defending internet freedom is critically important. We salute Secretary Clinton's priority of internet freedom and all efforts going forward. As Congressman Smith noted, his bill would go a long way towards keeping the internet open and fair. The Global Network Initiative is a voluntary initiative between NGOs, corporations, and governments. And this approach makes eminently more sense than governments alone trying to regulate the internet. And Mr. Smith's legislation takes that into account with respect to their talking to Google and NGOs and others to get the necessary buy-in. To have voluntary principles of conduct makes those principles much more realistic and applicable. And then finally, we need to invest in the forms of international broadcasting that will be necessary until the private sector can do this on its own. Government-funded broadcasting is never the ideal solution. Ideally, the private sector will produce objective, independent information. But until that happens, we need to take governments more strongly to task when they deny the broadcasting of the Voice of America, RFE/RL, or other international broadcasters. Also, we need to look seriously at the Broadcasting Board of Governors budget and see that new ideas and new creativity are involved in some of the programming of already strong content to make it more applicable and more interesting to the publics. Because in the end, it's the publics of all of these countries, not only in the CIS, but also in the former Soviet, also in the OSCE region, that will demand change and drive their governments to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comprehensive testimony. Mr. Suleymanov.
Thank you. Chairman Cardinal Hastings, Assistant Secretary President Congressman Smith, thank you for this opportunity to participate in this important hearing on the threats to press freedom in the OSCE region. My name is Muzaffar Suleymanov. I am the Research Associate for Europe and Central Asia, an international independently funded organization that defends press freedom worldwide. It is an honor to speak to you today and be a part of this panel. I will focus my testimony on the threats to press freedom in several countries of the region, particularly in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Russia. But before I proceed with CPJ concerns in these countries, I would like to commend the US legislature for passing the Daniel Pearl Freedom of the Press Act in April, and thank President Barack Obama for signing this important bill into law in May. As President Obama duly noted in the signing ceremony, journalists and bloggers worldwide put their lives at risk to deliver the news every day. And to honor that risk, world leaders must declare zero tolerance of media repression and urge their counterparts elsewhere to do the same. Although my testimony focuses on 3 countries, freedom of the press is threatened in many other OSCE member states. And now I would like to start by briefly highlighting of those threats. Investigative reporters in the Balkans, including in Serbia, Croatia, Kosovo, and Bulgaria, constantly face threats and endure violent attacks by nationalist and organized crime groups. In Azerbaijan, authorities continue to defy a binding European court decision which ordered the immediate release of imprisoned editor Einullah Fatulayev. In Ukraine, a lack of political will has derailed the decade-long investigation into the 2000 murder of journalist Georgy Gongadze. In Kyrgyzstan, unchecked violence against journalists, including the 2007 murder of editor Alisher Saipov, has forced independent reporters either to leave the country or practice self-censorship. In Belarus, police officers and security agents continue to harass independent reporters, and a recently adopted internet law threatens the last remaining platform for President Lukashenko's critics. And now I'm going to focus on the press freedom records of the 3 regional countries of concern for CPJ. I will start with the current OSCE chair, Kazakhstan, and then we'll talk about Uzbekistan and finish with Russia. The current OSCE chair does not live to the standards that should be set by the leader of the Regional Human Rights Monitor. Impunity in attacks against independent journalists, politically motivated prosecutions and imprisonments of government critics, and a restrictive internet law are the main issues that taint the country's record. 1 journalist was killed with impunity, and at least 4 became victims of violence in Kazakhstan in the past 18 months. Kazakh investigators have reported no progress in solving these attacks, most notably in the December 2009 killing of Kyrgyz reporter Gennady Pavluk in Almaty. Pavluk had reportedly traveled to Kazakhstan to raise funds for starting an online publication when he was found unconscious, sprawled on the overhang of an apartment building's entrance. He had apparently fallen from a window above, yet Pavluk's hands and legs were bound with tape. He died in a hospital 6 days later without ever regaining consciousness. Imprisonment on fabricated charges is another form of censorship that authorities use against their critics. Kazakhstan continues to hold in jail independent editor Ramazan Yesergepov and human rights defender Evgeny Zhovtis. Zhovtis' case is well known to this commission, so I will not go into the detail. But Yesergepov was jailed 17 months ago on a trumped-up charge of collecting state secrets because he uncovered corruption in the secret services. Despite an intensified domestic and international advocacy in the 2 cases, including President Obama's discussion of Zhovtis' case in April with President Nazarbayev, Kazakhstan continues to hold both men. My colleague at CPJ Europe and Central Asia Program Coordinator Nina Ognyanova, traveled to Kazakhstan on a fact-finding mission last week and tried to visit the Sergepov in prison in the regional city of Taraz. Authorities behaved rather bizarrely. They first granted her permission to meet with the imprisoned, but an hour later they declared that her access was denied. Ognyanov's attempts to receive an explanation for the sudden change of mind have so far been unsuccessful. CPJ is also disturbed by the retaliatory use of criminal and civil defamation laws against government critics, government control of the influential broadcast media, and introduction of repressive bills to gag recalcitrant outlets. Insult of the president of Kazakhstan or his families in the media, for instance, carries a prison term of up to 5 years. In one outrageous case, in February, an Almaty court issued a gag order against all media in Kazakhstan after several independent newspapers carried an open letter accusing President Nazarbayev's son-in-law in corruption. Kazakh authorities also heavily rely on civil defamation lawsuits, carrying exorbitant fines to bring critical outlets to their knees. In the last 2 years, government officials and state agencies filed more than 60 defamation lawsuits against independent media, seeking more than $3.5 million in damages. Free expression on the internet is under attack in Kazakhstan as well. Despite an international outcry, in 2009 President Nazarbayev signed restrictive internet law and privacy laws. A new internet law equates all web-based platforms, including social networking sites, personal blogs and chat rooms, with traditional media, and subject them all to the same severe restrictions. The law gives state agencies the broad authority to block all websites that officials deem in violation of Kazakh legislation. The broadly worded privacy law restricts reporting on government officials and carries harsh penalties for violators, including closures of media outlets and a 5-year-long imprisonment for individual journalists. Uzbekistan is another country of deep concern for CPJ. It is the leading jailer of journalists in Europe and Central Asia, with at least 7 reporters behind bars. Among those in custody is President Islam Karimov's own nephew, journalist Jamshid Karimov, who has been held incommunicado in psychiatric hospital for 4 years as a retaliation for his critical reporting on his uncle's policies. Jamshid Karimov did not even hear his verdict. In September 2006, security agents kidnapped him from the street in his native city of Jizah and threw him in a clinic at a neighboring region. No lawyer dares to represent him, local sources told CPJ, as no one dares to dispute what is commonly viewed as a presidential order. Press freedom groups, including CPJ, have repeatedly called on President Islam Karimov to ease his regime's grip on the media by releasing imprisoned journalists, unblocking access to independent news websites, allowing international broadcasters to work in Uzbekistan, and ensuring that security services stop harassing reporters. But the Uzbek government seems to have developed immunity to such calls and campaigns. CPJ urges the US government to work in cooperation with the European Union to press President Karimov on his state's appalling press freedom record and to condition diplomatic relations with Uzbekistan on the immediate release of our colleagues. Murder is the ultimate form of censorship, and impunity in journalist killing is the main threat to press freedom in the OSCE region. In Russia in particular, impunity has regrettably become the norm, to the plight of the independent press corps whose ranks are dwindling. 19 journalists have been murdered for their work in Russia in the past decade. Only in one case have the immediate killers been convicted, and even there, those who ordered the crime remain at large. Although President Dmitry Medvedev publicly promised that his government will ensure that the crimes against the press will be solved, the brutal reality has not changed. At least 3 journalists were killed in Russia for their work last year alone, with no progress reported in bringing the murderers to justice. No other case demonstrates the sharp disconnect between President Medvedev's pledges and his subordinates' actions than that of 37-year-old publisher Magomed Yevloyev. Through his website, ingushetia.ru, Yevloyev exposed high-level government corruption in his native Republic of Ingushetia, covered disappearances and killings of civilians, and called on regional leadership to resign. Authorities did not wait long to retaliate. In August 2008, guards of then Ingushetia Interior Minister Musa Medov arrested the journalist without a warrant shortly after his flight landed at an Ingushetia airport. The agents placed him in a police vehicle and shot him dead on the way to their headquarters in the regional city of Nazran. Rather than launching a thorough probe into the incident, both local and federal authorities swiftly sided with the shooter's account, declaring Yevloev's killing inadvertent. Investigators announced that the publisher was killed accidentally when he tried to snatch a gun from one of his 3 arresting officers. But the CPJ investigation into the case shows a number of inconsistencies in the shooter's account as well as in the overall official version of the event. And for those interested in our investigation, I would recommend taking a look at our special report called Anatomy of Injustice. It's available on our website, www.cpj.org. Currently, not a single person is held accountable for the murder. The shooter, a nephew of Minister Medov and the sole defendant in the case, never showed up at his own trial. The proceedings ended in December with negligent homicide verdict that carried a 2-year term in a low-security prison. But even that conviction did not stand. To the outrage of Yevloev's family and colleagues, in March, Ingushetia's Supreme Court announced that prosecutors overcharged the killer and released him by placing him under house arrest for 2 years. CPJ calls on this commission to raise Yevloev's case with high-ranking officials in the Obama administration, and we urge those officials to bring up the case in bilateral meetings with their Russian counterparts. A new independent probe is badly needed in Yevloev's killing. Mr. Chairman, CPJ commends this commission on holding this important hearing, and we urge you to make such hearings a regular practice. We recommend this commission share today's testimony with President Barack Obama and members of the executive branch, and urge them to actively engage with their regional counterparts on the pressing issues discussed today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your testimony. We don't have to formally transmit it. We have a member of the executive branch sitting next to me, so that message has gotten out. So it's taken lots of notes. I mean, you've used the terms regressed, cancerous types of activities that will jeopardize progress made in other democratic institutions within a country. Could you just share with me your views as to where we think we have progressed over the last 35 years within OSCE on the issues of freedom of the media, particularly during the last 10 years? Have we made progress or have we regressed during this period of time? Or just give us a sense of whether we need some self-evaluation here. It really does appear that we are moving in the wrong direction. Mr. Patton?
Well, certainly there was sort of an ephemera of press freedom from 1991 that continued on, almost as long as 2000 in various countries, depending on which countries they were. By calling out individual cases at times, it has put pressure on governments. The Yevloev case, which is brought up in Ingushetia, ultimately led to the dismissal of the president. So or was part of a chain of events that led to the dismissal of the president. So to the extent that the more egregious cases are repeatedly brought up, it does put pressure on the authorities. It's not a case of the media per se, but the lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who I believe, Chairman, you have acted on this case, actually touched a chord with the Russian people. Because he was seen as an ordinary lawyer who was fighting for basic rule of law and basic rights for Russians, and that put moral authority on President Medvedev to act. And now President Medvedev has made a number of commitments, but they have not been delivered on yet. So I would say that the progress that we've seen has been marginal, and there's other progress which is perhaps unintentional, just in the form of the internet and what the internet offers. So protecting the internet is probably the best thing that we can do going forward in order to allow news and information that's unfettered to get into many of these countries which are restricting it.
But you've said they're disturbing trends. You have me to believe that we're moving in the wrong direction rather than making progress for protection of democratic institutions concerning freedom of the press, we've actually moved in the wrong direction in too many places.
In the case of the countries of the former Soviet Union, it's what they are doing as opposed to what we're doing. Now, it can be argued we're not doing enough, but there is a concerted effort among countries like Russia, like Kazakhstan, like Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and others to repress the media. It's not an accident. These are not isolated cases. These countries are watching each other very carefully. They're meeting and they're discussing ways of repressing media freedoms, of attacking the internet in certain cases. We've seen cases of cyber warfare in Estonia and Georgia. So there is a concerted effort to attack media freedoms. So really, we just have to first recognize the existence of a concerted threat, and then address it as a concerted threat as opposed to individual instances.
OSCE is a consensus organization, so we don't have an enforcement arm to go out and require countries to do different things. But if the examples during the Soviet Union days are to be followed, Mr. Suleymanov's point about raising specific cases makes a huge difference. We did that very effectively during the Soviet days. And when you put a face on an issue, you can get much more attention than when you just talk in abstract numbers that so many journalists have been attacked. But each one of these journalists has a story, and that story gets told and told again. It does provide much more public pressure, international pressure, on countries to act. So I would hope that we would follow your example that you asked us to do.
Thank you.
Let me just point out also that I guess the point is, how do we make this a higher priority? Maybe this is a question you should be asking us, but how do we make this a higher priority? How do we make your job as the representative a little bit easier? You know, we press very hard for the administration on bilateral meetings to place higher priorities on human rights issues. And I think we've had some mixed success here. I think we've been successful in some cases. And obviously there's a lot of bilateral issues. Same thing's true within OSCE. There's a lot of issues within OSCE. And as important as the journalists and media issues are, there's one of many issues that are on the table. So I think our challenge is, how do we make this a higher priority? And I would just urge those of you who are working in the private sector to work with us to strategize as to how we can elevate this within the OSCE, within the United Nations, within EU, within our own governments. If you have thoughts on it, we certainly welcome your thoughts on that.
If I may, but first I wanted to get back to that.
Where we are?
The case of Magomed Yevloev, actually to reiterate on what you have said earlier, that we should bring faces to the cases, not to mention numbers, but speak specifically about the cases. And I believe it, and CPJ believes that it is important that U.S. government does not go shy about going on the record about discussing the cases and speak about it at their bilateral meetings or any other forums where it's possible, and raise the cases and speak about the cases. And speaking of the case of Magomed Yevloev, yes, you're right. President Zyazikov of Ingushetia was resigned, was dismissed after the murder. But at the same time, like 2 months later, he was reappointed as an assistant to President Medvedev. So it's not actually dismissal, but promotion. And the same happened to Interior Minister Musa Medvedev. He was reassigned to Moscow. And we urge this, as I said in my statement, it's important that U.S. government raises the cases, speaks about the cases on the record, and talks about them whenever it's possible. It's going to be a good boost for morale for the press. It's going to be a good signal to the governments that they have to adjust the cases.
Well, I agree with you. There is pressure at times for us to calm down a little bit because progress supposedly is being made. We find that that's usually just an excuse for us not to bring these issues up, and we're better off being as open and transparent in our concerns as possible. Thank you for that. Let me turn to Secretary Posner.
Yeah, I want to follow up exactly on what Senator Cardin was asking and discussing. First of all, I appreciate the testimony, and I would say from my perspective, the more information I can get about specific cases, the better I can do my job. I was in Russia 10 days ago for what's called a civil society dialogue or working group with Mike McFall and Surkov. We talked mostly about prison issues and about migration. I did raise specific cases. I raised cases with the government. I also met a range of non-governmental activists, including some I've known for a long time, and some bloggers and some journalists. And what they described was a very bleak environment where they are really feeling under enormous pressure. What they said, and what I believe, is that we need to be raising specific cases, and we'll continue to do it, whether it's Yevloyev or others. I want to just be kept up to date, and I encourage you to keep pushing us in telling us what are the cases and how to raise them. But I think that the bigger question for me, which is sort of coming back to what Senator Cardin said, is in the context of the OSCE, it's very easy for these issues to get lost or marginalized. And I think we ought to be thinking creatively of ways in which we can reinforce this is a priority in the context of that larger discussion. How do we create space? How do we create more public visibility for these issues so that governments, whether it's Russia or Kazakhstan or whomever, feel that there really is a growing sense of frustration and even outrage at what is a declining freedom for the media. It's clear from all three of your testimonies that we have a negative trend line here. And I think we ought to be calling that out and raising the energy for us and for other governments to be pushing, as well as the NGOs. So I would welcome thoughts now or later about things that we can do that would dramatize this in ways that take it to another level. I think we need to do that.
Thank you. In a way, Kazakhstan's chairmanship is a blessing in disguise. And the remaining 6 months, if they can take 1 or 2 positive steps, those could resonate in other countries. And taking criminal libel off the books would be one such step. I think it exists in 7 separate Kazakh laws. I think the Kazakh Ministry of Foreign Affairs would like to move on this. Ms. Mijatovic, when you're in Astana later this month, I would urge you to meet not only with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also with the Ministry of Justice and with the Ministry of Interior, if they allow you to do so, because that's where the action really has to happen, and also with the Presidential Secretariat, to be able to get libel off of the books. Now, the Kazakhs raised the issue that we also have criminal libel on the books, and I don't know, in obscure states, it exists on the books. It's never used because prosecutors know that there would be constitutional challenges to it. If we could make small steps in the right direction, symbolic steps, at least it would create an opening for the Kazakhs to reciprocate on those. And also look forward to next year when Lithuania becomes the chair in office, because there will be an opportunity to carry on this discussion in an important way, and I think quite possibly more constructive.
Congressman Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just ask, first of all, in the late 1980s, our delegation, OSCE, Helsinki Commission from the U.S., met with a large number of Duma members in Moscow. It was when Perestroika and Glasnost were beginning to have some meaning. It was before the first real election of the Duma. And we had a number of breakout sessions with our counterparts in the Duma, and I was in a number of them, including the one on press freedom. I'll never forget when Mickey Edwards, who was a member of Congress and a former editor, or publisher, I should say, of a newspaper, we were asked, what do you do when you're libeled, when false information goes out in the media? And both Mickey Edwards and I, a former member from Oklahoma, explained that we write op-eds, we talk to the reporter, we find alternative media, we find some way of getting our message out, and first of all, we talk to the reporter, and if that doesn't work, and the information false stays, we try some other means. I'll never forget how they laughed. They broke out in laughter and said, well, he should go to prison. And I'm wondering to what degree, since the 90s or 80s, that was the late 80s, in Russia, that mindset vis-a-vis media freedom and the ability to have unfettered comments, hopefully if there is true libel, although as public officials it's hard for us to sue, people can take to the courts and in a legitimate way get some kind of remedy. Secondly, here in the United States and worldwide, obviously there is no statute of limitations on murder. And Ms. Mijanovic, I thank you in your written testimony, and I got here a little late, so I didn't get it, but I just read it, for admonishing us never to forget the brutal murders of journalists. In looking over your list, the names of the murdered journalists absolutely matches the very names this commission has steadfastly brought up in bilaterals and larger meetings with countries where we believe there has been complicity by the government. You mentioned Slavko Čurubija. You might find it of interest that when I chaired a hearing with him prior to the bombing in the former Yugoslavia, Mr. Čurubija testified and was absolutely brilliant in his presentation about the excesses of the Slobodan Milosevic dictatorship, and he did it all in open meetings. And right after the bombing began, he was summarily executed, and that remains one of those there's never been a prosecution that we know of. Maybe you know of one, but thank you, because I do believe that to a country that feels they can ride out the criticism from the West or from democracies, it has to have a chilling effect on other journalists who say, look, they never did anything on this particular journalist. A reign of impunity continues. The countries just need to fold their arms and do nothing, and we never get satisfaction with at least a prosecution. If you could speak, maybe all of you, to the chilling effect that that kind of impunity has on the current journalists, because you're a little less likely to be as aggressive as you might be if you know a jail cell or a bullet awaits you. And then let me also ask you, if you could, on the issue of anti-Semitic hate and those websites which sadly originate and are housed disproportionately in the United States. We have, as you know, the First Amendment. It's a hallowed human right that every American absolutely cherishes, but no human right is absolute. And we know, as you brought attention to on child pornography, that's certainly not protected speech. And I would argue vigorously that anti-Semitic hate is not protected speech either, because it often leads to incitement of violence or the threat of violence. And I wonder if you might give us some advice, since you're still on the panel, and maybe the others as well, how we can get around this seeming impediment to going after those who promote such virulent hate. I mean, one of the things that our combating anti-Semitism on this commission has done so well, we just keep learning more and more about just how virulent this is. I remember at one of our OSCE PAs, we actually had the World Conference on Jewry speak to the whole issue of what most of us, all of us, frankly, would never see. In terms of video games that can be downloaded that goes after Jews. Natan Sharansky twice testified before our commission and brought the soap operas that pass for entertainment, largely emanated out of the Middle East, but they obviously through satellite TV make their way into the homes all over Europe and I guess in the US. And he showed us a clip. And when the lights went back on, and Ben will remember, Mr. Chairman Gardner will remember very well, you could have heard a pin drop because it was just so sick, perverted. And yet that passes for, that's protected speech. So your advice, perhaps, on how we can continue in our case to cherish this First Amendment freedom of speech right, which is in our Constitution, but realize that this is anything but, in my opinion. If all of you speak to those questions.
Well, I think you raised an important issue in terms of protected speech and hate speech, particularly next year as Lithuania takes the chairmanship. The Russians are going to make a big deal out of this with respect to different views of history as opposed to anti-Semitism, and it will very likely be an important issue in the Lithuanian chairmanship. I'm a little bit limited in terms of actual solutions that I'd offer, except I think Oliver Wendelholm said the best antidote to bad ideas is good ideas. So keeping the internet open and providing more countervening information, which the Russians certainly do in the negative sense. When good information gets into Russia, you see mobbers and other bloggers come on and put a lot of negative information to try and lose that in a larger stream. But the more that can be focused on media content and corrective information, perhaps that could be useful.
Yeah, I agree with Sam Patton about the use, the very use of this legislation, whatever comes to mind. It's a really tricky question because, as Sam brought it up, in Russia they largely use extremism charges against media websites. Those extremism laws have been developed to counter neo-Nazism in the internet, spread of hate speech. But they have been abused severely, and I can't say specifically how to develop and what should be developed as a law, like what should be incorporated, how to counter the hate speech, and how to put a margin between the two, between the freedom of the speech and between the hate speech. But those bad examples of the countries where the legislation is being abused should be taken into consideration.
Just briefly, I mean, this is the whole new subject. I mean, hate speech as such, it's very worrying trend, and the problem that we are facing in many countries. But it's also, I would call it a double-edged sword, because sometimes it's used as as a tool in order to explain that any critical voice or anything that is provocative is then understood as a hate speech. And when I talk about this, I really use my own experience from my own country and from the region when it comes to hate speech of any kind. If I may just say that the issues that you raised are of course extremely problematic, but the best tool and the best way is education. I do not see any other tool that can solve this problem short-term or long-term. Education of our citizens, education of journalists, using all possible ways to reach people, to discuss these issues. And it's not a problem that can be solved overnight. And it's not something that this office or different offices that are dealing with these issues can solve in a moment. But I think that coordination between different institutions, working with NGOs, with the journalists, working with public, and for this commission, I mean, just the very fact that you are raising these issues constantly, and this is not the first hearing. My predecessors, both of them had opportunity to talk before this commission, so this is not a new attempt. So it's happening all the time, and I would welcome, and something like that. It's so important because the message is sent to all those parts of the world when people are struggling to have a free speech and to have possibility to freely express themselves. And when it comes to the OSCE, and you also raised it, Chairman Cardin, what can we do? What the institution like this one can do in order to fulfill the mandate even better? I think it is the right time to strengthen and to, in a way, implement the existing commitments, because I see the problem in the implementation of the existing OSCE commitments when it comes to media freedom. So strengthening the existing commitments and raising the voice of the importance that all 56 member states are really complying with these commitments is something that might help.
I can just one thing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Yatovich, you might be the one to answer this, but the other distinguished witnesses might want to touch on it as well. The whole case for the Global Online Freedom Act, not the whole case, but the primary impetus came out of the arrest and incarceration of a journalist named Shi Tao in China. His email was intercepted by the Chinese secret police, the cyber police, and because of that he got 10 years in prison. The only thing he had sent that was used to convict him was information about what not to do vis-a-vis Tiananmen Square when the massacre remembrance came up in early June, and he sent it to an NGO in New York, and for that They apprehended him, they had all the information they needed, they had all of his contacts, so other people, you know, almost like the list begets another list, begets another list. And the Chinese government, it seems to me, has perfected this tool of repression better than anybody else on earth. Vietnam has picked up on it, Belarus, the other countries, Turkmenistan. My question is, in your view, what influence is the Chinese, I mean, they're a walking point on internet repression. I don't know anybody else who has done it better, and maybe you could disagree, and I'd love to hear it. But what influence are you seeing on the ground in OSCE countries, particularly the top 5 I mentioned, and the ones that you have focused on, with regards to China's influence, with regards to sharing worst practices with those countries? If you could speak to that.
When it comes to the influence, they have certain, OSCE countries, I think it had an influence on the whole world. But the best thing, if there is anything good, that it was so much discussed in public. It was so well known, the way this is happening in China. When it comes to the influence to certain countries of the OSCE or sharing the certain tools, how to do it, I really do not know, and I do hope that this is not a fact, that actually it's not happening, because different countries are inventing different tools of suppression and restrictions of the internet. They are using it by blogging, some countries are using it by introducing different legislation. But again, I repeat it, and it's a third time today. In the long run, it is a long battle, because the means that can be fine. I mean, there are different means, but people always, what is happening in Turkey with YouTube? I was present in Turkey when certain YouTube clip was blocked, and you could not access it via Internet Explorer. But people found a way how to use a different, engine search in order to see this clip. So there are always ways, and the governments will try to suppress, and it was also happening with the traditional media until we found the certain standards. But the China case has the influence to industry, to society. Also on a good side, because we are aware of this problem. We are aware, and we are trying to find the best possible way to stop this kind of
We understand that China has sent internet advisors to the Central Asian countries. If that's something you could look into, in your role, that would make an enormous difference, because obviously they're sharing, we think, how to apprehend the journalists and the best and the bravest and the brightest in all of these countries who simply want human rights respected.
Russia would be probably the next area of concern, because clearly the Chinese are far ahead of the Russians. Internet penetration is approaching 40% in Russia, and I think the Russians are probably learning from Chairman Mao in terms of letting 100 flowers bloom. They're watching, they're waiting, and when the time comes, there'll be more repressions in Russia. I think China is certainly a market leader in terms of internet repression.
Thank you so much.
Well, let me thank all 3 of our witnesses. This has been extremely helpful to us. We can assure you this is a continuing interest, and we will request that, particularly from Secretary Posner's request as to specific information on cases. It's very helpful for us to get that. And we will raise these issues at every opportunity we can. We do think putting a face on the issue is critically important. So as much of the information you can share with the Commission would be helpful. And in regards to your work as our representative on this, we want to work with you. So please share with us your strategies. We think we need to take advantage of every opportunity we can to elevate the importance of this issue. The trend lines are not the way we want to see them. We want to see progress made. We wish we could spend most of our time highlighting favorable practices of countries of taking steps to open up the free discussion of views in their country, including investigative reporting. So we look forward to working with you with a strategy to reverse the current trends and to be able to highlight progress that has been made. And with that, the Commission will stand adjourned. Thank you.